Well, I'm very grateful for this opportunity. Thank you to Dr. Capes and others who organized this and the opportunity to present. I've not done much in pseudepigraphy in the New Testament. I've spent considerable amount of time in pseudepigraphy and Second Temple Judaism in the last several years. And as I started to do so, I recognized that the conversations that are happening in Second Temple Jewish scholarship about the issue of pseudonymity and pseudepigraphy are quite different from those that are happening in New Testament scholarship. So I have the distinct privilege today of leading off our discussion with not solving any problems, but probably creating a new one. So without further ado, let's look at pseudonymity, the theory of New Testament pseudepigraphy in light of Second Temple Judaism. Now, you may have seen there have been a couple iterations of this paper I put up on Academia. I put up and taken down and put up and taken down on the shared Google Drive that Emma has set up. So there are a few redactional layers that you will find, but the one that's on the Google shared file is the most recent one. By way of introduction, it's commonplace in New Testament scholarship to regard a number of New Testament books as pseudonymous. The presumption is often put forward that the practice was utilized in early Judaism and simply adopted by early Christians. But such presumptions seldom take into consideration the nature of pseudepigraphy in Second Temple Judaism and the marked difference the role of authorship takes in early Christianity. This paper examines the various reasons why Second Temple Jewish authors wrote in the name of revered figures or in the name of other people, and how for them the actual author or historical author was not a primary concern. This, it will be shown, stands in stark contrast with early Christianity, for which authorial identity and often apostolic authority was of some importance even in the first century CE. So while this cannot in itself prove the absence or the presence of pseudepigraphy in the New Testament, it does establish that there is a distinction between the role and practice of pseudepigraphy in early Judaism and early Christianity that may be a factor in examining how we understand the practice in the New Testament. The study of pseudepigraphy in the New Testament has long been influenced by debates in early Christianity. In his famous 39th Festal letter, Athanasius chides the, quote, simple folk who believe that the books, presumably one Enoch, belong to Enoch, which he asserts is the task of heretics. This view, coupled with the fact, as Annette Yoshiko-Reed says, the most sustained and sympathetic attempts to understand pseudepigraphy have come from research on canonical examples, means that the most substantive ways of addressing the question may have a vested interest in the outcome and may not consider the origins or nature of the phenomena in the first place. Many, perhaps most advocates of pseudonymity in the New Testament adhere to a view that it is not intentionally deceptive, but was undertaken with a school of churches or particular writers and recipients where they were aware of the practice as, quote, living traditions. This is, as Jimmy Dunn contends, is evident in a consistent pattern in the Jewish background to the issue of pseudonymity, New Testament pseudonymity. And Dunn goes on to articulate three features of this background. A fundamental absence in this reasoning, though, is the common inattention to the role of authorship in the reception of texts in antiquity. It's well known, as we've seen, that among the primary reasons for acceptance of writing in the New Testament canon, at least in some way, pertains to affiliation to the ancient and authentic authorship of a given text. And yet these views give little attention to the similarities and especially the differences, the role of the author in pseudonymous works and their respective Jewish and Christian contexts. This is a decisive omission. There's room for looking more closely at the phenomena and especially recent scholarship discussing the nature and practice of pseudepigraphy in Second Temple Judaism to make sure we are comparing like things. As we'll see, there's a complex of factors to be considered in Jewish pseudepigraphy, almost none of which have to do with actual historical authorship. Pseudepigraphy in Second Temple Judaism. Recent scholarship of ancient pseudepigraphy in the context of Second Temple Judaism elucidates the important cultural phenomena at play in the practice, and generally agree that there are three categories of the practice in Judaism. The most important of these for our purposes is perhaps the one that more likely comes to mind in this literature. This includes documents in which the primary speaker of a work is the main figure within it, and is understood to be a revered ancient figure. This category presses the named figure into service to strengthen the work's authority. This is called authoritative pseudepigraphy, which is best suited to legal material and prophetic and or apocalyptic utterances. Works that fall into this category are often autobiographical in nature and would include works like 1 Enoch, 3 Enoch, Jubilees, 2nd Baruch, 3rd Baruch, 4th Ezra, Apocalypse of Abraham, and a few others. From Qumran, one could include the Genesis Apocryphon, the Testament of Naphtali, the Aramaic Levi document, even the Temple Scroll, and Psalm 151. A subcategory of authoritative pseudepigraphy encompasses the few instances where texts are falsely ascribed, that's pseudonymity, to a figure, fictional or historical, who lacks the authoritative recognition enjoyed by others. These may include works such as Tobit or the letter of Aristeas. Other works, such as biblical antiquities, are mistakenly attributed to Philo of Alexandria. Still others, Jewish and Christian, may attribute authorship to a figure not from the Hebrew Bible, but from pagan contexts, such as the Sibylline oracles, or Gentile figures, such as Pseudophocilides, Syriac Menander, Pseudohecataeus, and so forth. The reasons for pseudepigraphy in Second Temple Judaism. There are several that have been posited regarding the practice in Jewish contexts. Some libraries, such as the famous Alexandrian Library, collected works of well-known writers. So one might write in another person's name to gain a place among well-known writers. This could be done to get a hearing of one's own views, whether to counter a false claim by an opponent or opponents, or to draw the circumstances of the ancient figure into the context of the real author's setting. So, for example, the author of 4th Ezra draws from the biblical Ezra. The book of Ezra is set in the context of the return from exile and reconstitution of the temple. 4th Ezra, drawing from Ezra's narrative setting, is written after the destruction of the Herodian temple in 70 CE, and the affinities between biblical context and the time of writing were overwhelmed by the author's pressing interests. We see something similar happen in our own day in recent days, like with President Zelensky in Ukraine. Do you remember when he gave his speech before the British Parliament and he paraphrased Churchill? And his purpose was not to claim that he is Churchill or claim to be Churchill. His purpose is that he's evoking an idea that they will fight to the end and applying it to his own context, to draw similarities for his listeners. In some instances, the genre of a work may influence the figure to whom it is attributed. Sapiential material would be attributed to Solomon, hymnic writings to David, legal writings to Moses, and so forth. Another important example pertains to claims to Mosaic authorship. Hindi Nyman has shown how the attribution of the book of Jubilees to Moses functions as part of a broader, quote-unquote, Mosaic discourse begun in Deuteronomy. This in no way raises suspicion about the nature of the document, nor does it challenge the authority of Exodus or Numbers in the so-called rewritten scripture kind of notion, which it in some ways reproduces. Instead, she claims, it extends Deuteronomy's retelling and expansion of earlier Mosaic traditions. This shows, as Annette Reed observes, that Jewish examples of pseudepigraphy do not base their authority on the status of the chosen pseudonymous author. Instead, the importance of figures utilized pseudepigraphically lies in their claim not to authorship, but to divine revelation. and so appeals to Moses, Enoch, and others is not due to their personal authority or particular office, but the traditions surrounding them as conduits of divine revelation. For Second Temple Jews, in fact, the practice of writing in one's own name is surprisingly rare. Works where the actual author is indicated, such as Ben Sira, Philo, and Josephus, are, again according to Annette Reed, exceptions to the general rule of the continued dominance of anonymous and pseudonymous authorship within Jewish tradition. Personal authorship, who actually wrote forth Ezra or Jubilees, is never discussed in the context of Second Temple Jewish texts. The role of the author and the reception of pseudepigraphy. The importance of personal authorship and authority residing with its author seems to be a Hellenistic development. And so it's not surprising then that it is largely in Greco-Roman context that the means to discern the authenticity of a document originated in these contexts from the 3rd century BCE. So we know, for example, of instances of Pythagoras, of Livy's disdain for the practice, of Galen describing remuneration for those providing works, and so forth. But there is no evidence of this concern in Second Temple Jewish context, where, as I've said, writings can gain a hearing by its affiliation with a succession of prophets, from Moses to Ezra. It may be that works written in the name of an esteemed figure were intended to elaborate on that figure and were thus attributed to him. In this rubric, texts expand on traditions and associated with the figure on which they are founded. Thus, the ancient figure serves to furnish a context from which views are espoused in that figure's name. And research examines the evolution of discourse associated with such figures. For example, prominent among the Jewish writings from the Second Temple period is the Pseudepigraphon 1 Enoch, a compilation of works associated with the figure Enoch from Genesis 5:24. There's considerable material from this work found at Qumran. K4 alone contains 11 manuscripts of portions of 1st Enoch from the early 2nd century BCE to the 1st century CE and related literature. As one scholar put it, the Enochic tradition was alive and well at Qumran. Qumran also housed texts that utilized Enochic material, such as the 8 copies of the Book of Jubilees, a copy of the Genesis Apocryphon, an Aramaic Levi document. George Nicholsburg opines that either the Qumran sect attracted people who prized the Enochic material or itself fostered the copying and use of Enochic texts. Regardless, it is generally recognized that Enochic texts formed an integral part of the sect's community, life, and religious observance, particularly in relation to calendar. Furthermore, their preservation and likely duplication at Qumran suggests a high degree of compatibility with the Qumran sect's eschatological outlook, its dualistic cosmology, and view of special revelation. So the Enochic material was preserved and likely copied at Qumran and was influential for aspects of Qumran's theology. Yet there is no clear evidence that the identity of the historical author of the Enochic material was an important consideration in those instances. The material was compatible and useful for their purposes, and while claims or simple inferences of prophetic origin of Enochic texts may have played a role, we simply do not know. But the point is that in the preservation, transmission, and use of these documents, there is no evidence that communities had much regard for actual authorship of the documents in use. Of course, arguments from silence are dubious, and it is the case that we have almost nothing until Christian times written about why such documents were transmitted and how they were regarded, and obviously in the early process of reception of these texts. But the salient point for my argument is that the authorship that is never debated or discussed among Jews of antiquity, who preserved and who used these texts, becomes an important issue for early Christians. Largely, I would suggest, due to the designation of the apostolic office and its corresponding authority. To this subject we now turn. Pseudopigraphy and the study of Christian documents. The ancient practice of pseudepigraphy is well attested in early Christianity, where the issue is often one of pseudo-apostolicity. Some scholars have contended that among early Christians, at least, texts known to be pseudepigraphic in nature were rejected as authoritative. They often cite Tertullian's criticism of the presbyter writing in the name of Paul, or the account of Serapion cited in Eusebius regarding the so-called Gospel of Peter. At times, early Christians received pseudonymous works, mistaking them for authentic works. A letter allegedly written from Pilate to Tiberius concerning Christ was thought authentic, as was the correspondence of Paul and Seneca. Herein, though, I think lies the crux of our conundrum. For early Christianity regarded historical authorship, especially apostolic authorship, as in some sense important for its authoritative role in early Christian communities. This is generally the case whether the ancients were right or wrong about their assessment of authorship. We even see in the early Christian documents themselves, such as Second Thessalonians 2, the same concern. Here the author claims that within his own readership, people have approached the Thessalonian church in the author's name with a teaching that was not authorized by Paul. This is 2 Thessalonians 2, 1 and 2. Some may regard the Pauline authorship of 2 Thessalonians as dubious in itself, but it at least shows that within early Pauline churches, the affiliation of the author, presumably known to the readers, with the document itself carried some particular importance. Of course, other early Christian, meaning New Testament documents, particularly some of the undisputed Pauline letters, such as Galatians, point to the importance of the personal authority of the apostolic figure tied to a particular teaching. This notion is largely unknown in the context of Second Temple Jewish pseudepigraphy. Whatever can be said about the practice among Jews of the Second Temple period, it must be recognized that they do not seem to share the same concerns as early Christians. This is a fundamental difference omitted by most scholars. So, conclusion, what have I done? What I've attempted to show here is really quite modest. I've not proven the presence or absence of pseudepigraphy in the New Testament at any theoretical level, nor have I assessed the viability of the designation to any particular New Testament text. What I've attempted to show is that the nature and practice of pseudepigraphy in Second Temple Judaism takes on quite a different character when the layers of anachronistic and pejorative caricatures are peeled back and the phenomena is recognized for what it is within its own religio-historical context. And I've tried to raise the point that at least some of what the ancients were doing in their literary context utilized priorities and concerns that differed from those in early Christianity. In this respect, further discourse on the nature of pseudepigraphy in the New Testament must allow the voice of the robust and fruitful scholarly inquiry available in the field of pseudepigraphy at Second Temple Judaism to at least have a seat at the table. Thank you.
I want to take some time now for questions or comments or thoughts.
Yeah. Dan, the question about the relationship between Jews and Christians and the areas of pseudepigraphy, as you know, the Christians also welcomed Enoch, and they also produced a lot of literature that are very much like the Jewish pseudepigraphy, and the 5th, 6th Ezra, and the 4 Ezra that you mentioned, several things, the Sibylline oracles, are parallel. So the first Christians were Jewish Christians, and so shouldn't there be a little bit of a connection in there? I don't dispute that they have a different agenda with authorship. I agree with you on that. But what about that parallel relationship?
Yeah, that's a great question. So what do we do with the early Jewish Christians who were practicing pseudepigraphy and some of the let's complicate the question further, because I don't know that I have a really clear answer on this. Testaments of the 12 Patriarchs, yes, which I think was probably originally a Jewish document, but that Jewish document is no longer recoverable. I think it's thoroughly Christianized. And so that is classified as a pseudepigraphon. But there's no question there about authorship. So, and that we start getting into questions that I don't know how to answer about what the preservers and transmitters of the testaments of the 12 patriarchs and the other Christian pseudepigraphy that are written in the name of Old Testament or Hebrew Bible figures, what they're doing in the practice, what they're trying to do. That's something I haven't broached into. I simply don't know. What I'm trying to do, so this is where I open a lot of, I welcome a lot of input and correction here. What I'm trying to do is, as I worked on the Pseudepigraphy and Second Temple Judaism, I realized that a lot of the conversations that were happening when I'm teaching classes like on Second Peter or the pastoral epistles, there's discussion about pseudonymity in those books, in scholarship, and much of it concerns pseudonymity that is in early Christianity, that is in 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th century, and reads back into the 1st century to what's probably happening in the New Testament. Others, like what Professor Dunn has done, find some parallels in the practice in Second Temple Judaism and makes a transfer to what's happening in the New Testament and presumes that there are some points of similarity, which there are, without drilling further into seeing what kind of differences might there be. And so what I'm trying to do with my conversation, so the short answer is I don't know how to answer that. What I'm trying to do is cut off the discussion and say, what can we know about pseudepigraphy from texts that we know to be Jewish that date from the Second Temple period? And so primarily I'm thinking demonstrably Jewish texts that date from Bar Kokhba or earlier. And that's sort of my cutoff. So do you have some...
Well, you didn't mention a particular text that supports exactly what you said, and that's the Baba Bathra 14b and 15a, that focuses not on authorship but on the transmitters of the text, and they attribute to other people in 15a. And
Okay.
That supports your notion of authorship itself is not a critical issue.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. Yes?
Hello, Dan. Thanks for your paper. Maybe this is a selfish question for my paper tomorrow. Isn't there a difference between anonymity and pseudography? Because it seems like to me, you merge the two, and you looked at whether some of the texts within Second Temple Judaism anonymous compared, because especially when you link with Tertullian and Thessalonians, there seem to be issues, the fact that someone is claiming authority using someone else's name compared to anonymous text.
Where you mean Second Thessalonians is claiming an anonymous?
No, it's not claiming anonymous, but it's against those who are purporting to be Paul's letters, because that person who's writing the particular letter, signing it as Paul, is claiming authority.
Right.
But isn't there a difference, though, when you go even to the gospel and others, where it's actually anonymous?
Yeah, it is different. Yeah, that's a great point. It is different. And that's something I didn't touch on much at all, and that's anonymity. So with the book of Hebrews, we have some papers coming up on Hebrews. They're going to help us out with that. With the Gospels, which is primarily where I work, they're all anonymous. So you can't really even use terms like pseudopigraphy with those works, because there is no claim to personal authorship, at least no explicit claim to personal authorship. So you're right. I didn't try to conflate anonymity with pseudopigraphy. What I tried to focus on was just pseudopigraphy.
Yeah, Steve. Dan, thank you. That was really helpful. Can I ask you to push a bit further on the Tertullian question about the Gospel of Peter?
Sure.
Doesn't that suggest there is actually a controversy about whether it's okay to pretend to be an apostle or not?
Sure.
Which suggests the Christian texts are not as unified as you appear to be suggesting.
Right. Yeah. No, you're right. You're right. So here's what else I have not really done. What I've not tried to do is say that that all early Christians are decisive on the issue of personal authorship. What I am trying to say is that for early Christians, the issue of personal authorship was important for authority within the Christian communities. Not necessarily universally so, but it certainly was. It was an important part of the canonical process. It was an important part within the discussions and so forth. So yes, there are questions within that example of the Gospel of Peter, and I haven't gone very far, certainly not as far as Dr. McDonald has gone into looking into the primary sources. My point is to simply say that the early Christians there was a concern with actual historical authorship in many instances, whereas in the Jewish texts, the nature of pseudepigraphy, that's never discussed. It's never an issue.
So, but does that suggest that the author of the Gospel of Peter was claiming authority by attaching the name of Peter to it?
That I don't know. Probably. Or claiming, and so again, I haven't delved further into that. It also brings up interesting questions about Jude's citation of one Enoch, because he cites it as exactly like the rest of the Second Temple sources, like what Annette Yoshika Reed and what Hindi Nyman have said, is the importance is not the person in the office, but their role as a prophet and as a visionary. And so that's exactly what Jude does when he cites from Enoch. He talks about the prophetic nature of it. So he doesn't talk about the personal authorship or things like that. So,
Paul?
Yeah, thank you very much. Are there features, okay, we do have pseudepigraphy 2nd century and beyond writings. Are there features of those clearly pseudepigraphal texts that are really quite different from 1st century text or the canonical text?
That's a great question, and I don't know. As I've worked on this, I'm working from the back end forward. So I know the Second Temple material. I haven't gone very far into the early Christian material. So that's an excellent question. I don't know. Yeah.
Just one little detail. I've just edited a major collection on archaeology, John and Jesus, that Erdman's will be publishing next year. And Craig Evans did a really nice overview of the 24 essays. And he notes that the phenomenology, the verisimilitude in the Gospel of John is very much different from 2nd century Gospels or narratives. That material doesn't represent Palestine familiarity and
Sure.
mundane knowledge. So that's just one example of real differences between, say, like Gospel of John and Mark, as opposed to later pseudepigraphal.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
So you made a brief comment about the Mosaic tradition of healing to Mosaic authorship, and what got me thinking about that pattern of competitive textuality which we find in Second Temple literature, such as Joseph of Asenath or the editions of Daniel, etc., which is seeking to retell and correct the narratives that are already there. To what degree is that normative, and then to what degree can we extrapolate that into things such as Paul and I area in the Gospel of John, where John 21 seems to have a similar sort of internal competitive nature to the rest of, to complete or to round out or to correct or whatever approach we take the rest of the Gospel. I mean, is this a normative thing for Second Temple Judaism, or is this something that the authors of Joseph Asenath and the editions
Yeah, that's a great question, and I am not. I've read some of Chris Keith's work on the textual competitiveness of early Christian Gospels, and I don't. Okay, good. Yeah, and here's the exception to that rule, and that is again at Qumran. Multiple copies of particular documents, let's just say 1QS, that have differences, and that the same sectarian community was kept and used competing versions of the same text. It just doesn't work. So I think that at least in that instance, let's just say, what are Jews able to do? I don't know. Let's just say that in the preserved archive of Qumran sectarian documents, there's evidence that they are content to allow differing versions of the same text, even rework Pentateuch alongside Pentateuch. That was my point about what Hindi Nyman was saying, that her whole thesis of seconding Sinai, it's not replacing Deuteronomy, it's developing and appropriating, and like to your point. So I think that at least in the context of Qumran, they had elbow room for different versions or different distinct emphases and wordings on the same kind of document, even the same document, that did not create the problems that it creates for us today. Yeah.
As a follow-up, I wonder if you could speak to the theory that Qumran is a set of libraries, because that, of course, would make that sort of competitive nature, it would mean that they're not necessarily competing with one another, but they're more kind of referential or something like that.
Yeah, that's great. Wow, we're getting well outside my comfort zone. That's a great question, and I think that the preservation of materials in the various Qumran caves defies the kind of uniformity that we would expect of sort of, let's just say, a fundamentalist theological context. I mean, they would weed out things that they allowed. I mean, I mentioned some of the things that they had similarities with respect to with one Enoch. There were also some differences, and they allowed some of those differences. So I don't get so to what degree there is a coherence to the collection of sectarian and non-sectarian material that's preserved at Qumran. I think the preservation indicates some kind of utility for the sectarian community. But that's not the same thing as uniformity. So how's that for a kind of a vague, but I mean, this is a perennial question. To what degree can we call this a library in any sense? It's a collection of, can you call things hidden in 11 caves around miles of desert a collection? Yes, but there are certainly, there are similarities and differences, and the ancients who preserved them, who are responsible for their preservation, seem to allow for the diversity of views within certain parameters. Yeah, sorry.
Oh, yeah, great. Thanks for really stimulating paper. I was fascinated by your comment about the issue in early Christianity is often pseudo-apostolicity. Could you comment on, is there some kind of different authority structure going on? In Judaism, the great authorities are mainly in the ancient past, Moses, Torah, whereas in early Christianity, the great authorities are the apostles commissioned by the Lord in the recent past. Would that give us some angle on it, or is that not?
I'm not sure, and I'm not sure I would say that the great authorities are the individuals of the ancient past. And this, again, I'm thinking of what Hindi Nyman's telling me here, that the importance of Moses, of David, of Solomon is that they are recipients of revelatory experiences, and so they come to experience, like Apocalypse of Abraham and so forth. They come to experience those in elaborative ways in Second Temple material. So I'm not sure I know enough to make the one-to-one correspondence between the authoritative figure of the patriarchs, for example, and the authoritative role of the apostles.
Well, I know we're about out of time. Daniel, thank you. The question of authority has come up several times, and I'm thinking about, Baucham's assertion, like about the Testaments, because you've mentioned them several times. They're transparent fiction. So everyone knew they were fiction. An article I recently did, I looked at when an ancient source cited a testament, did they cite it as a, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, kind of idea? But whenever they cited it as authoritative. So Targum, Pseudo-Jonathan cites, it tells the story of the patriarchs. and he pulls something from the Testament of Zebulun, I think it is, and he cites it as part of the authentic traditional story of Levi, I think it is. I mean, they always seem to cite it as this is what happened to Abraham. This is Peter Davids does this with Sarah being submissive. You know, it seems to come from Second Temple literature, not from the Genesis story. But they cite it as authoritative. So they seem to know it not as a transparent fiction. So this is...
I'm not sure what... this is intriguing. There are a couple of things that come to my mind. One is you're talking about the Targums, Targumim.
Well, that's
so we're talking... I'm slightly allergic to post 200 CE. I'm just starting to understand that the Mishnah can be useful for New Testament. I'm a little allergic. So that's as late as I go. The other thing is I'm curious as to what you mean by authoritative.
Well, they cite it as representing, they cite it like they do the rest of the Tanakh.
Meaning it's historically accurate for what it's trying to, okay. See, I'm not always convinced that authors cite ancient texts to say that this is a historical representation of fact as much as they are citing texts to say this is useful for my purpose and for my literary purpose in writing to my original readers. Which can sometimes...
You don't think Jude is needing that to be a historical...
Well, even with the... Let's go back even to Jude and talk about the debate with the fighting over the body of Moses, which you and I read today and the people in our church read it today and think, what on earth is that about? Jude is using that as an illustration. His presumption is that it's familiar to the readers, or the whole passage makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. So my point is to say, I don't think that Jude is making a claim about the historical veracity of this scene that he's citing at all. I think that's tangential to his purpose. I think his main purpose is to say to his original readers, you're familiar with this story, and this story illustrates the point I'm trying to make about our present crisis. So whether or not, what my concern is, what I don't want to do, and this happens a lot in my own context. I'm an evangelical Christian, where everybody wants to read it and say, if it says it's got to be historical, which is okay and is often true, but I want to get to first, what is the author trying to say to the original reader? And to me, that's where, and now this is my own confessional stance, this is where the authority lies. What is the text saying to the original reader? And then we start to develop from that. So what I want to say to Jude, and what I want to ask Jude, the hard questions, I want to say, what are you trying to say about this text to the original reader? Are you trying to say it's authoritative? What do you mean by authoritative? That it's historically accurate? Or I think, in my opinion, in that context, the better way to understand that is to say that it is useful for his purposes, whatever else he may think or not think about that passage. Does that make sense?
I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, you might not agree, but that's okay. I'm used to being wrong. I have, as Lee reminded me, I'm used to being wrong, right? I have 3 teenage kids, so I'm wrong all the time.
Got time for one more? Anybody?
I do have my email address on that paper that's shared on the in the Google Drive that Emma set up. So please do feel free to email comments, suggestions, corrections, whatever. It's still a work in process. So,
thank you. Thank you very much.
I think
one more.
more.
Oh, sorry. I didn't see you.
How similar is what you've said in this paper to David Mead's thesis in his book Pseudonymity and Canon, where he did his dissertation under James Dunn, whom he appealed to, that the pseudonym is not so much a claim to literary origins, not focused on the author, as it is to prophetic tradition. And would that be equivalent to what you said?
It's not equivalent. It's similar, but I'm not trying to draw conclusions about the presence or absence of pseudonymity in the New Testament that he is. I'm not even going there. I'm just trying to frame the question in the context of demonstrably Jewish texts from the Second Temple period to say if we're going to make claims about sort of the Jewish practice, let's make sure we're comparing apples to apples and not apples to oranges. So what is the current scholarly discussion about the nature and practice of pseudonymity and pseudepigraphy in Second Temple Judaism, and let's identify it, let's name it, let's talk about its characteristics, and then let's start making some comparisons. Absolutely.
Yeah, unlike you, he takes the Old Testament and does the same thing with the New Testament. So
Yeah, yeah. I'm much, much more narrow than him.
Thank you very much, James.